maybe we could start, because I haven't yet spoken to anybody who sort of laid this out for me, so maybe you can do this for me. How the world came to understand this, the shaken baby syndrome. Where did this come from?
The basic problem, I think, is babies who are about 6 months of age, usually under a year, but in that sort of young age group, babies who present at hospital with a triad of findings of subdural hemorrhage, that's hemorrhage in the membranes around the brain, retinal hemorrhage, hemorrhage in the eyes, and a swollen brain or some sort of brain malfunction that causes them to have seizures or to be miserable. It's quite a wide spectrum of clinical findings which fit into the brain disorder. But these little babies, all of the same sort of age, who present at hospital, and there's no apparent reason for their collapse. And because babies who have suffered trauma, like a major road accident or falling out of a window or something, will also have this pattern of bleeding, it's always been considered that there must be some sort of trauma, even if there's no evidence for it.
Where did the leap come that somehow this trauma must have been caused by shaking?
The difficulty is these babies have the same symptoms or signs as babies who've been subjected to trauma, but there's no evidence of trauma. So it was suggested that if the trauma was such that it didn't leave any mark, that could be one possible explanation. And one trauma that was proposed was shaking. And this was drawn from experiments that had been going on in the 60s into road traffic accidents, suggesting that people who are involved in a road traffic accident have a severe whiplash injury may get subdural bleeding without impact to the head. So experiments that had been done on adult monkeys were taken as an example, and it was thought that if these monkeys could get subdural bleeding, maybe the same could happen with babies. And this was put together as a hypothesis that shaking would produce whiplash, which would damage the vessels that take the blood out of the brain into this dural membrane that surrounds the brain and back to the heart, and that would explain shaken baby syndrome. It was never tested, but it was seized upon by the pediatric population at the time, the pediatricians, because it was an explanation for the findings when there was no evidence of trauma.
They had these babies presenting and they couldn't explain it, and somebody came along and gave them an answer.
Yes, and that was seized upon, and it was adopted as a standard explanation for babies in this age group, very young babies, with the triad.
I mean, I don't know if there's precedent or other analogies that you can draw, but this became orthodoxy, didn't it?
Absolutely.
Why was it accepted, a hypothesis accepted so readily, do you think?
Well, that's a very good question. And it wasn't until about 17 or 18 years later that any research was done into it, as far as I'm aware. And the first, and perhaps the most important study, was one done by Dr. Tina Duhane, who's a neurosurgeon, who did a clinical study of babies who were thought to have had non-accidental injury and studied the biomechanics. So used one of these crash test dummies, and she looked into the effects of various different traumas on these babies, whether shaking or impacting the baby against a surface would cause the sorts of forces that were thought to be required to cause the bleeding.
Mm-hmm.
And she found that in all the babies that she looked at who were thought to have had non-accidental injury, there was evidence of impact. And she found that if she took a crash test dummy and shook it and then compared that with impacting it onto a hard surface, that the forces she got from impacting were 50 times greater than those due to shaking alone. So she wrote a paper saying that shaking alone is not enough, and that maybe a shake plus an impact would cause the injuries.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, in 1988, she wrote a paper which was entitled Shaken Baby Syndrome, Is This a Misnomer? Because shaking would not account for either the findings on scan or the pathology in shaken baby syndrome.
Right.
That was in 1988, and yet it got buried. And still, the hypothesis that shaking was the cause of shaken baby syndrome was current and was the mainstream view. and still is held as the explanation for these babies by many, many people.
And you used to accept it, right?
I certainly did, yes. I read the textbooks. It's there in the textbooks. And it wasn't until about 2000 that I was aware of the work of Jenny and Geddes that I sat down and questioned this. And I suppose I should be ashamed to admit that I hadn't really asked the questions before, because it's in the textbooks. We accept what we're taught.
You were taught it.
Exactly. It was the standard mainstream hypothesis.
And you testified.
I testified that if we have that triad of findings, if I see a brain that's just swollen, no evidence of trauma, but a swollen brain, and I'm told there's subdural bleeding and retinal bleeding, that's shaken baby syndrome. But then in 2000, I was aware that Jenny and Geddes, who is a very senior neuropathologist, or at the time was a very senior neuropathologist in London, had done the largest study to date of the pathology of the brains of babies thought to have suffered non-accidental injury. And her findings were in fact quite astounding, and she said that these babies don't have traumatic brain injury, they don't have shearing and tearing of the nerve fibres in the brain that we would expect to see, but they have swelling and they have the effects of lack of blood and oxygen supply to the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Now that was important for several reasons. One, that it's not straightforward traumatic brain damage that we would see in adults, and two, that if the changes that we're seeing are those of brain swelling due to lack of oxygen, this takes time to develop. So that gives you a period in which a baby may be unwell, but not necessarily collapsed between the time of injury and the time of collapse. And this is something which hadn't previously been understood. It was always thought that if a baby is the subject of inflicted injury, the baby would collapse at once. So Geddes' work really introduced also the concept that there can be what's known as a lucid interval.
Was that your so-called eureka moment?
I think it was the pathology that was my eureka moment, and I thought, wow, if we don't really have any evidence of trauma in these babies, we have to start thinking of other explanations. And from that time on, I've certainly read an enormous amount and done a lot of work. I've looked at many cases, and I've done a lot of writing about the anatomy and the development of the infant brain that may predispose these babies to having these findings.
Is there such a thing as shaken baby syndrome, to your mind?
Well, I think no, not shaken baby syndrome. So the
can you shake a baby to death? Then?
Yeah, I think you can. I think it's possible to shake a baby, cause significant neck damage, and kill him or her. I haven't seen one, and I haven't read of one, but I think it's at least theoretically possible. At least a small infant, 0 to 3 months. By the time you get up to 6 months and a 17-pound kid, it's pretty difficult to hold a 17-pound object in front of you and shake it. It's just physically difficult.
So if it's theoretically possible to do it, then what's the problem with the syndrome? I mean,
well, the syndrome is subdural bleeding, retinal hemorrhage, and brain swelling. That's the syndrome. In fact, if you are able to cause injury or death, it's not by causing subdural bleeding, retinal hemorrhage, or brain swelling. It's by causing structural neck damage, and then death because you interfere with the brain stem centers that control breathing.
Yeah. Tell me about your study in 2001. Tell me what you looked at and what the significance of that was.
Well, in 2001, I did a study looking to see if there were instances of lucid intervals, instances in which people had a head injury, appeared to be okay, and subsequently died. And the reason I looked at that was because I knew at that time that retinal hemorrhage was a secondary phenomenon. I knew that children could be fatally injured from a fall. I didn't know about the lucid interval part for sure. I thought that there would be, but I didn't know. So
and why was that important?
Well, because that was part of what the pediatricians and pathologists were teaching regarding infant injury. You know, that number one, infants and children cannot be killed by a low-level fall. And by low level, I mean something like 2 or 3 or 4 feet. They said can't happen. They said any child with an ultimately fatal head injury cannot have a period of time in which he or she appears to be normal. In other words, it's immediate collapse. The last person standing when the music stopped is the one that did it. Third, retinal hemorrhage is only found in abusive head trauma in infants and children. And I said, well, let's see if I can find a database to either support or refute it. Now, I would never be able, let's say that I did a study and I couldn't find anything that refuted that hypothesis. That does not mean that the hypothesis is correct. It's the one black swan problem. You say all swans are white, and you keep on looking and looking and looking and looking, and all you find is white swans, and then all of a sudden there's a black one or a pink one or a brown one. And so the purpose of experimentation and the scientific method is really to try to disprove your hypothesis. If you can disprove the hypothesis, then it's out. If you can't disprove it, then it stays around as an hypothesis forever and ever. So I tried to find a database in which there was a reasonable possibility that an instance of head trauma would be observed or witnessed by somebody else, because the pediatricians and pathologists had been dismissing for many years any eyewitness account by a caretaker or a parent. They just simply said, since we know that this can't occur, if they're telling us it occurs, they're lying. And there's actually a publication in the early 90s that says exactly that.
And if they're lying, they're likely culpable.
Oh, not likely, they were culpable. Yeah, that's one of the so-called red flags for child abuse. They're telling you, giving you a history that is impossible. Okay, so the history is they fell off the couch. That's impossible, therefore they're lying, therefore they did it. So I looked at the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission database for head and neck injuries involving falls. And I chose that database because it involved playground equipment or playground accidents. And I said, well, you know, there's a reasonable likelihood that folks out on a playground, there's going to be people other than the family observing these events. And in an 11.5-year period in that database, and they had 3 different files, and I don't need to go into the details of the files, but there were, out of 600 some reports, there were 100 and some deaths, 114, if I recall correctly. Of those 114, the majority occurred when a piece of equipment collapsed and struck someone in the head. The next most common category was a accidental suffocation or asphyxiation when a jacket or a drawstring from a sweatshirt became entangled with the equipment and strangled or smothered whoever it was. And the final category was people that fell off of those playground equipments. And there were 18 fatalities over that 11-year period reported to the Consumer Product Safety Commission. The age range was 1 to 13, not because I chose the pediatric population, but because 6-month-old kids are unlikely to be on a slide at a playground, and people yours and my age are also unlikely to be on slides or swings or whatever. So there were 18 fatalities, and I was able to get the records, complete records, on all of those events, and it took a long time because I didn't have a grant. This is all, I just did this all myself. I had to get family permission. I had to find out who the families were and so forth. Well, at the end of this time, of the 18 fatalities, it turned out that 12 of those fatalities had lucid intervals, periods of time in which they appeared to be okay. 12 of them were witnessed by 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people who were not caretakers and not family members. Only 6 of the events had retinal examination while the kids were in the hospital. Of those 6, 4 of them had extensive bilateral retinal hemorrhage. And so I was able to disprove the hypothesis offered by the pediatricians and pathologists in 3 areas. You know, first, short falls can kill. Second, retinal hemorrhage can occur with characteristics said to be specific for inflicted trauma. And third, there may be a period of time in which somebody with an ultimately fatal head injury appears to be okay or uninjured.
Just taking me back, when did the whole shaken baby controversy come across your radar screen?
I don't remember the exact date, but Audrey Edmonds was convicted in 1998, and her case was quite controversial, even at the time she was prosecuted. I didn't really pay a lot of attention to it, though, for a number of years after that. It was sometime then in the early to mid-2000s, probably, that we were notified of the case and started looking into it.
So give me a thumbnail sketch, then, of the Audrey Edmonds case.
Sure. Audrey was, she was your classic middle American woman, married, living in a suburb of Madison, much loved by her community. She ran an in-home daycare service where she was really a role model for other daycare providers, known to be remarkably patient and sweet. She had a child. One of the children was dropped off at her home one morning. Hadn't been there in a few days, and the child was unusually fussy that morning. Hadn't taken her full bottle as usual and whatnot, and within less than an hour the child became comatose, essentially, in her home, and Audrey called 911, thinking the child had choked on a bottle of formula. The first responders came, thought it was a choking incident, took her to the hospital, but where they quickly found that the child had the classic triad. The retinal hemorrhages, the subdural and subarachnoid hemorrhages, and the brain swelling, and they said, well, this must be shaking. And from there it went downhill for Audrey. She was convicted and sent to prison, and she served 11 years in prison before we were finally able to reverse the conviction and get the charges dropped.
And how were you able to do that?
Well, it was interesting. The reason we got interested in this case in the first place is because, well, not only because she was an unusual case of wrongful conviction in that she had really excellent trial lawyers and a really excellent appellate lawyer, and they were both very concerned that she was absolutely innocent and approached us about that. But we really started getting interested in the case then when we realized that the pathologist, the medical examiner who had done the autopsy on the child in this case and who had testified against Audrey, had publicly declared that he had misgivings about not this case per se, but about some of the things he had previously believed, including that he had previously believed that there could not be much of what's known as a lucid interval. That is, once a child is injured, they become unresponsive, comatose, essentially quite quickly thereafter, and therefore the person who's with the child at the time is most likely the attacker, or the one who inflicted the injuries. This doctor subsequently had an experience with a child who was admitted to a hospital and was under trained medical personnel supervision for about, I forget what it was, 16 to 18 hours before the child became comatose, before the child went into distress. And trained medical personnel hadn't been able to detect the brewing brain injury during all of those hours. And so this doctor went back and started doing the research and realized, you know what, there's actually good research showing that a lucid interval is real. And so he wrote a letter to the Journal of the whatever it's called, the Medical Examiner's Journal, saying that, describing this experience he's had and saying, you know, lucid intervals are real. We need to re-examine what we've been saying about this. So we called him up and said, you know, how does this apply to Audrey Edmonds? And his response was, oh my goodness, Audrey Edmonds, what are we going to do about her? And so we went from there.
Yeah. And so just finish the story then. So what happened?
Well, we then assembled a team of experts to look at the case. And really what happened was that Audrey was convicted of a first-degree reckless homicide, which requires proof that she caused injuries to the child and did so with reckless disregard for human life. She caused injuries that caused death and did so with recklessly and with utter disregard for human life. So to prove all of those elements, the state relied exclusively on the medical testimony. Medical testimony showing that the child went into distress in her care, therefore she had to be the one that did it. There's, you know, she's the one who caused it. And they offered testimony showing, suggesting that this had to have been caused by shaking, and that the shaking had to be so severe, they testified, so severe that it would have been the equivalent of throwing a child out of a third-story window or driving into the car, a child at 30 miles an hour. And therefore, it had to not only be reckless, but also had to have been done with such utter disregard for human life that it was a first-degree offense. So that was the testimony. We went then and we started looking into it, and what we found from these other experts was actually you can't diagnose shaking based solely on those medical signs and symptoms, that there are lots of alternative causes that could account for it, that there can be a lucid interval, so even if something was done to this child, you can't time it to Audrey Edmonds necessarily. And we found out that, in fact, this whole theory that the amount of force is the equivalent of throwing a child out of a second or third story window and whatnot has no basis in science whatsoever. In fact, the state's experts admitted that it was merely sort of anecdotal, the kinds of thing they were referring to, and that, in fact, subsequent research had established that children can sustain these kinds of life-ending injuries from falls off of small pieces of furniture or playground equipment. Mm-hmm. So basically, the new science undermined or seriously questioned all of the elements that had previously been established by unquestioned medical testimony.
Why do you think that belief in the triad came to be so firmly held?
You know, it's hard for me to know, but what I can surmise from talking with the medical experts in the field is that this was a theory. It was proposed as a theory, and it was one that made sense. It made sense to doctors, and they had no other theory to replace it. So it quickly became taught in medical schools, and it became sort of accepted dogma. That's what everybody emerged from medical school, having been trained and having been given no reason to doubt it. They just accepted it. And of course, you can't shake children to test the theory. So it's really hard to prove or disprove it directly through those kinds of testing. And so people just sort of accepted it, never questioned it. And so when you come along and say, wait a minute, that may not be right, it runs counter to everything they've been trained about this with unquestioning authority previously. Mm-hmm. So it's just very hard to replace sort of an old dogma with new truths.
Yeah. It is being questioned now, though, and
it is being questioned quite widely.
So what does that mean in your world, the fact that the science is now starting to question some of the dogma?
Well, from our perspective as lawyers representing people convicted of crimes, it's an interesting case study in sort of that intersection between law and science, where science is always contingent, it's always changing, it's always developing as more research is done, whereas the law demands finality. We want an answer now and we want it to be done with. And so that's a real problematic scenario when you're basing prosecutions entirely on scientific theory. You're demanding the finality of a criminal conviction in a case where it's based entirely on scientific theory that is shifting and growing and changing and being replaced all the time. And so what that means for us is that it's very likely that there are a lot of people in prison under these final sentences and convictions who may not have committed the crime. Almost certainly many of them did not commit the crimes. And so we need to find a way to reopen these cases, to admit the new evidence so that fact finders can consider the new evidence now and say, wait a minute, we can't be so sure that this person committed this crime. Or in some instances even we can come in and say, you know what, we actually know what happened and it wasn't shaking, it was some natural cause, it was some disease or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm. How important is the emerging science to what's happening in the courtroom?
Well, I mean, because these prosecutions were all science-based. I mean, it's what Professor Deborah Turkheimer has referred to as a medical diagnosis of murder, and that's a pretty apt way of looking at it. There's no other evidence of murder except you got a dead child and the doctors come in and say it had to be murder. Because these prosecutions were built solely on the science, when you come in with new science then that says, wait a minute, we might have had it wrong, that of course should be what it takes to re-examine those cases in the legal world as well. And that's what's starting to happen in a lot of cases now, is that people are going back in and re-examining the basis for these convictions and presenting new medical evidence to show either that there's an alternate cause that can be established now, or at the very least, that the foundations for the medical testimony in the past are seriously questioned now, so that you can no longer be comfortable concluding that the person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
From a legal perspective, what is the most compelling new science that's emerging?
It depends on the case. It really depends on the case. Because you know, it can be everything from the science that suggests, the biomechanical research and other science that suggests you simply cannot cause these kinds of injuries by shaking a child alone, at least not without severe neck injuries, which you usually don't see in these cases. That can be it, or it can be new science about rebleeds, where you've got a case where the child had a chronic subdural hematoma. You can have evidence of a rebleed, can provide an explanation for it. I think the new evidence on lucid intervals is extremely important, because it's that timing element that has permitted prosecutors to convict people by saying it had to be that person and no one else, because we know the child would have been immediately comatose. You really can't say that now. And so that's a very important legal distinction. Even if somebody did something to this child, you can't say that it was necessarily that person. And then there's so many important pieces of the puzzle scientifically. And the other piece that's really, really important, I think, is the fact that we now know that impact can cause so much more force on the brain than any amount of shaking. That we now know as well that even minor falls, accidental falls, can cause this. So they used to testify widely, and the prosecutors would admit that they used to testify widely that short falls can't kill. Well, they don't say that anymore, because they now know short falls can kill. And so you can't just look at a case where you've got a dead child with brain injuries and say, oh, it must be shaking. It can't be an accident. It has to be intentional. Well, no, you can't say that.
This is based on Dr. Plunkett's research.
This is based to a large extent on Dr. Plunkett's research, indeed.
Now, the criticism the other side would make of Dr. Plunkett's research is, well, look, he looked at 18 children of all ages, only 2 or 3 of them were babies. You can't draw any conclusions from that kind of a sampling.
There were children of all ages. Some of them were infants, though. And if the point that the prosecution's witnesses are testifying to is that short falls can't kill, if you find cases where short falls did kill, you have disproved that theory. And that's what Dr. Plunkett's work did. And it doesn't stand alone. Dr. Pat Lance in North Carolina is now doing a lot of work looking at children who died, and people of all ages, including a lot of infants who died from all kinds of causes unrelated to shaken baby syndrome, and finding the same kind of eye injuries and brain swelling and whatnot in a lot of these children. So it's not just Dr. Plunkett's work that stands alone, but I think to dismiss Dr. Plunkett's work on that basis misses the point, which is, all you got to do is find one to disprove the theory, and then it's disproved.
In light of all this, then, in your opinion, is there any validity left to the syndrome, to the shaken baby syndrome?
I'm not a scientist. I can't answer that question. My own personal view is that I'm very skeptical of the science of shaken baby theory because of the biomechanical research that suggests it can't be accomplished, because of the fact that despite the ubiquity of video cameras in our society today, I've never seen an example of a shaking death caught on film. We have examples of accidental falls off playground equipment that have resulted in death. There's just so much and there's so many other explanations for it that have been overlooked, that it looks very suspect to me. But I can't make that judgment. What I can say is that you can't identify shaken baby syndrome as the cause of most, if any, of these injuries, given the state of the medical science today. It's just not there. There is interesting research ongoing and new studies coming out today that give us greater insights, but I've not seen the science yet that proves it, and I think even most of the ardent supporters of shaken baby theory, when pushed, would admit it's a theory.
The new science, if it's as compelling as you and they say, why are there still prosecutions going ahead at all?
Well, there are very good, well-intentioned scientists who still believe in shaken baby theory and are working really hard to try to prove it, and who make great witnesses. And you know, when you've got a dead baby, it's a really compelling case for the prosecution. People want answers. They want to know what caused this child and who can be blamed for it. And when the estate comes in with a string of experts who say it has to be shaking, and the defense comes in, no, it can't be, we think it's this, or we think... The impulse is there, I think, to say, well, why would they lie about that? Why, you know, how can they be wrong? Not to understand the science even, but to say, these are well-meaning doctors who say it has to be that. Who am I to second-guess that?
Yeah.
It's a really tough thing to ask a jury to decide. I mean, look, the scientific community itself, the medical community itself, cannot come to an agreement as to whether shaken baby syndrome is causing these deaths. How do we expect a group of lay jurors to figure that out, and to figure it out beyond a reasonable doubt? It's really pushing the criminal justice system beyond its capacity to resolve these kinds of things.
Yeah. You are involved with the International Innocence Project, so
right.
I'm guessing by virtue of that you may have some international view of what's happening. How would you describe the state of play now in terms of shaken baby syndrome and what's happening with the courts?
It's hard. It's in tremendous flux right now.
Yeah.
There's a lot of turmoil going on about this because there has been now a real awakening in some segments of the legal community about the problem here. And so there have been growing efforts to try to stop the stem of unfounded prosecutions and to undo wrongful convictions. That in turn leads to pushback from prosecutors who try to marginalize the experts who testify for the defense, try to marginalize the projects that represent the defendants, and courts are sort of left somewhere in the middle trying to figure out what's going on. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they've figured it out yet. We're sort of in that middle land where we're trying to still wade our way through this. I will say that I think the United States lags behind Canada and the United Kingdom in addressing this, at least in Canada with the gouge inquiry, and the United Kingdom with some serious inquiries by the Attorney General's office there. There have been serious attempts to get to the bottom of this to some degree. There's not been much of that in the United States at all. We're hoping to get there. We have called, for example, for the National Academy of Sciences to do an investigation into shaken baby prosecutions, bringing in scientific experts from a wide array of fields, but who don't have a dog in this fight, who aren't invested in one side or the other, who can evaluate the merits of the arguments on both sides and tell us, well, at least where's the common ground, what is it we can say, what is it we can't say. So we're hopeful that that kind of thing can come in and help the courts figure out what to do with this, because it's really pushing the capacity of the courts to resolve these kinds of issues.
Where do you think it's going to go? I mean, just given the sort of the tenor of the debate to this point, and I mean, are you hopeful this is going to be resolved in some way, or is there a big fight still to come?
I think there's still a big fight to come, but I'm hopeful that in the end the research will improve and help us come to some resolution, and eventually people will stop talking past one another and start figuring out what they really can agree on and what the science can support and what it can't, and the courts will come to some conclusion about what it takes to convict someone of abuse, where there's nothing but medical evidence. So, I hope we get there someday. We're not there yet.
There is growing scientific debate about a diagnosis that sends shivers through virtually all parents, certainly many parents, shaken baby syndrome. New research suggests the widely accepted syndrome may actually be a physical impossibility. You're looking at a scene there that you'll see tonight an investigation led by the Fifth Estate's Gillian Finley into shaken baby syndrome. There you see Gillian in the shot, and here she is with me as we talk about what she's learned, and thank you for coming in. A lot of things have to happen before a doctor even considers a diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome. What are the factors? Let's start there.
Well, for 30 years, shaken baby syndrome has basically been based on a hypothesis, and that is if doctors see three specific symptoms, they feel competent to diagnosis. One is a baby has a swollen brain. Second is there's hemorrhages in the baby's brain in specific places. And third, there's hemorrhages in the retinal area behind the eyes. Now, if they see those things and there's no other explanation for those, doctors have traditionally felt safe in saying this is shaken baby syndrome. That science is now under attack.
With this new research that is challenging the convention, and what does this new research tell us?
It breaks down into two parts. One is what the pathologists have been doing. They've been looking at those hemorrhages in the brain and behind their eyes, and they're discovering that really there's an awful lot of reasons why a child might have hemorrhaging there, and you can't just attribute it all to shaking. Broadly speaking, that's what they're finding. The second, as you alluded to in the introduction, is the biomechanical research. Biomechanical engineers have been trying, and they're the people who are responsible for all our safety equipment, airbags, car seats, that kind of thing. And they've been trying to model what goes on in a child's brain and what the force necessary to create the kind of brain injury. And they haven't been able to do it. There have been people convicted in this country and others of having shaken their babies to death. And the testimony has said, they must have shaken them for 5 minutes. It was massive shaking. Well, I can tell you, I went into a lab and I tried, with all their fancy equipment to shake a crash test dummy. I couldn't do it for more than 10 seconds. So it really, all of this together is bringing into question the diagnosis.
But that's an interesting point, and that's certainly one of the many very interesting aspects of your report is when you try to replicate that yourself. You do a demonstration to see how it unfolds in your case. But you've raised an interesting point, and that is the implications of this research for parents, and we know there are many cases, accused criminally in the courts of shaken baby syndrome.
Yeah. We don't know how many convictions. We can't find good, reliable numbers in this country. In the United States, they estimate 200 people a year, parents, caregivers, are convicted of shaking their children to death. Yes, I mean, there's no question there are people out there. And a couple of years ago in Ontario, they actually did a review of shaken baby convictions in light of the emerging science. And now there have been 2 cases where the verdicts have been overturned. And there are 2 more that are under review at the moment. So, the courts in a way are sort of pushing the envelope a bit and taking the science to the logical conclusion.
You're going to introduce us in the course of your investigation to people who have been directly implicated in this, and one of the couples as part of your report is Zabeth and Paul Bain. Here's a little bit of tape of their speaking to Gillian.
They brought a doll in and wanted me to demonstrate how I shook her, which obviously I couldn't do. I didn't shake her. And they were hollering and hollering, and I couldn't take it anymore. I started to vomit. My body started to seize, and they had to call an ambulance for me.
And then trying to pit us against each other. They said, oh, your wife told us that you did it. She admitted to it. And then said the same thing to her. And I'm like, no, she didn't. No. I know better than that.
Strong story from the Bains. What happened in their case?
They did eventually get their children back, but they had 4 children. They lost all of them. They were never convicted, but they lost all of them because of the diagnosis. It took them 4 years. They had to take the BC government to court. Eventually they did get their family back, but they say this just underlines, the danger of the diagnosis, and that the medical community has to think more critically about what's happening.
How is the medical community responding to your findings, to this issue in general?
Well, they're not my findings. These findings have been out there for a while now. And, and as you would expect, I mean, after 30 years, there's a lot of entrenched interests. Some medical authorities and researchers are taking this and running with it. Others are digging in their heels and saying, look, we just don't buy this. We see this all the time. People occasionally confess to doing it. So we're perfectly comfortable with the way we've been diagnosing.
Okay. Gillian, thank you. Again, look forward to tonight. Gillian's investigation on the Fifth Estate this evening. Diagnosis Murder, Shaken Baby Syndrome is the title, and you'll see it at 9 p.m., 9:30 in Newfoundland.